couple of these teacher training things before. So some of the stuff which we're doing today, it's not like strictly dependent on things which have come before. There might therefore be a little bit of repetition if you've kind of been in some sessions which I've done before, but they won't be the main focus. So some things you will see which you might have seen before, but hopefully most of it will be kind of relevant stuff, which is useful to think about. And in particular, what I wanted to focus this kind of on was the question, what are they all thinking? Because this is one of the questions which I think it's important for us to try to be able to answer as we are helping students, working with them. And it's also not a straightforward question to answer. So if you're just like, by way of kind of like, give me some sort of visual indication, a wave or whatever, if you've ever kind of just been like baffled by this, like what are they thinking, what's going on inside the heads of my students? Yeah, seeing a few hands. Thanks, Dan, thanks, John. So I'm going to try and split this up into two things, depending on how we do for time. So the first is, what are they thinking? Which is a subtly different question. You'll see I'm missing the all, but we'll come back to that. To begin with, one of the other sessions which I did was called, do they understand what I taught? And here I'm proposing we look at a slightly different question. What are they thinking? And they sound quite similar. I would say that they are actually subtly different though. So what I'd like to do is take 30 seconds, think about what do you think is a difference between these. Maybe you can't articulate, or maybe you've got some idea what the subtle difference between these might be. If you have an idea, can you type it in the Zoom chat, but don't press enter just yet, because I want to give people some time to think. So kind of 30, actually, we'll say 1 minute. 1 minute to think, type something in the Zoom chat if you think you can articulate a difference, but don't send it because I want everyone to have time to think. So roughly another 30 seconds of that. Remember, if you have some thoughts on how you might articulate the difference, put in the Zoom chat, don't press send just yet though, so others have time to think uninterrupted. So correct and moment of truth, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to count down from 10. When I reach 1, if you have something to send, then you can just send it. So 10, I'll do 5, count from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So what we've got coming through, so Daniel was saying that what questions in their head? Gregory, one's relating to concepts covered, the other is relating to prior concept. Mark, about the weather or about instructor being boring. Chandra, are they enjoying? Are they engaged? How do they feel about it? Stephanie, understanding broad and thinking. Alvin, my point of view versus theirs. John, one thing you might be related to teaching. Atanas, yes, open. So, okay, skimming the answers then, what I'm seeing is kind of a couple of things coming up. So one is, well, do they understand what I taught? It's very specifically related to something you think you've taught, and it's like, yes or no, do they understand that? The other is more open. Because it's more open, it permits lots of things, including things which might be completely unrelated, such as, oh, what am I gonna have for dinner or whatever. Which I think is absolutely true. Another thing in there which is interesting is the idea of like linking what I'm teaching compared to like other things. So like, what are they thinking? It's maybe not necessarily to do with what I've just taught. This is kind of, we're going to focus more on the things related to teaching and instruction. So it definitely is true. What are they thinking could include the wider, like, you know, I wonder if they're thinking about dinner or if they're paying attention. We'll come to that idea of engagement later on, but we're gonna focus it on sort of specifically what is the difference in the context of thinking about ideas related to programming, say. And here, a distinction which I think is helpful is the idea behind real-time and lagged assessment. So real-time, if you imagine we're on a pirate ship, if you're going into the bird's nest, you've kind of got your sort of telescope and you're looking and you're thinking, are we going in the right direction? And if not, oh, we need to correct course. Can you, Captain, please steer a bit kind of clockwise? Because, you know, we're going to hit that iceberg or whatever. And lagged is, by contrast, your ship arrives somewhere and you have a look and you think, is this the island which I thought we were going to arrive at? Like, does it look like, you know, on my map, I thought we were going to arrive at this spot here. How we arrived at that spot there. So that's a distinction I'm trying to draw between real-time and lagged assessment with the analogy of a pirate ship. I'm wondering now whether, firstly, on real-time assessment now in the context of teaching, say. So there's that pirate ship, and you can make sense of it, kind of the pirate ship. But why is that real-time assessment important? Why might we not just want to use the lagged assessment? I'm going to ask Caroline. Caroline, take us off mute. Do you have any thoughts on why might real-time assessment be an important part of assessment?
Because you'll make sure that the whole group is on the same page, or you can see kind of if there's something else you need to go over again or something like this. Yeah, sorry, it made me really nervous.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Caroline. So it's kind of like, see if there's something you might need to go over again. I'm liking how that sounds. Maybe let's try and bring in the concrete sort of idea of that sign of the island which we arrive at. I'm interested in why, like in the context of a pirate ship then, let's say, like if you were a captain of a pirate ship, like why would it be sensible to have some real-time assessment and not just depend on lagged assessment? I'm going to go to Abdi. What are your thoughts about, if you've got a pirate ship, why do you want someone in a bird's nest?
Yeah, so I guess because if you've got real-time assessment, then you can continuously like change your course so that you're going to end up the right direction, because you're continuously changing your course to ensure that you're going in the most effective way to your final destination. Whereas if you've got lagged assessment, you can end up miles away, and then you check maybe 3 hours later, and that's all dead wasted time. And so it's less efficient, and in the end will result in maybe a less efficient way of getting there.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Abdi. So like bringing those two things together. So exactly kind of as Abdi's saying, let's imagine we're the captain of our pirate ship, and we kind of plot our path to our island where we know we want to go, which in this case represents some kind of learning objective. And we chart a course, we plan out our route. Yes, if I go like this, I'm going to reach my island. Cool. And you set off and you're like, crew, let's go there. But if you use no real-time assessment, you just kind of, at some point, you arrive at an island and you check it out. You're like, cool, is this the island? But it turns out, like, you know, there should be some treasure here, but there's no treasure here. You're on the wrong island, because at some point, unbeknownst to you, you drifted off course because there's stronger wind than you're expecting or something like that, or your calculation was slightly off. So as Caroline was saying, it's like kind of maybe this idea of like going over something again, or in the case of our pirate ship, like at some point you're setting off and you ask someone of your crew, can you go up to the bird's nest, please? Like have a look ahead with telescope, like does it look like we're going in the right direction? And they say, oh no, Captain, it looks like actually like we've drifted slightly off and we need to now like head like 20 degrees kind of counterclockwise to get to the island you want to go to. And you're like, great, now I can course correct. And in the context of a lesson, that might be going over something again. It might be changing your explanation. So that's why real-time assessment is really important and helpful. And it's not the only thing you should be doing. So that kind of lagged assessment is still has value to show, yes, you are at this destination where you think you are. And they're also not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think it's worth saying where, for example, if you have something big as a learning objective, you might break it down into smaller learning objectives. And arriving at smaller learning objective might be an indication you're on the right direction to the bigger one. So they're not like completely distinct, but I think it's a helpful distinction to have in mind. And so what I'm interested then in kind of, actually, let me go back. My question now is, how do you think this maps back onto this question here? Do they understand what I taught? What are they thinking? How does that kind of map onto real-time versus lagged assessment? I'm going to go to Alwyn. Alwyn, do you have thoughts on which out of these two is more kind of what are they thinking?
I would say it's actually a bit of both. I actually see it as a bit of. I see it as a bit of both. I can't see, because of real time, it's what you're thinking in real time, what they're thinking, because right, they might be actually distracted or something and might be a bit behind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just see it as a mixture.
So what about the other one, Alwyn? So the first question was, do they understand what I taught? Which one do you think that's closest to?
Probably lagged.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks,
Probably
Alwyn.
lagged.
So do they understand what I taught? It's when you've got that clear, concrete lesson objective in mind. Do they understand it? That's, am I at the right island? What are they thinking? You're right, it's a bit of both, and that's an indication of them not being mutually exclusive. I would say it's a bit close to real time, because it's kind of like, what are they thinking? Is this going to lead them to getting to the right island, to the right learning objective? If we carry on, will they understand what I've intended to teach? So that's kind of how I would think slightly differently about the two. And we're going to kind of proceed onwards, learning strategies for what are they thinking? That's what we're focusing on. We're not trying to just do they understand what I taught, but we're trying to focus more on the real-time assessment. And one strategy is called cold call. So this is a big distinction to a classic thing which most first-time teachers do, whether you're in the classroom or whatever. This is really, really common, where, and I'm going to give an example of this, where here's a situation. Let's say that I am teaching a lesson about arrays. And I say, does anyone know what arrays, what index they start at? And I kind of say this in a tone of voice when I invite kind of hands up, sort of in sort of implied kind of tone of voice. So arrays start, like, where do you, like, what index do they start at? And let's say I see a hand go up. Jake's got his hand up, let's say for the sake of argument. So I say, oh, Jake, tell me, like, you've got your hand up, arrays, what index do they start at?
0 usually.
0 usually. Thanks, Jake. And I'm like, perfect, amazing. Like, I asked a question, hand went up from Jake, he got it right, awesome. This is really common. It's not necessarily the most useful thing to do, though. So I'm going to give you kind of 30 seconds to think. So why might that not give me a good sense of, like, that pirate in the bird's nest trying to look around, like, are we going in the right direction? That sort of style where I ask a question, a hand goes up, I ask that person and they answer. Why might that not give me the best real-time data? I'm going to give you another kind of 10 seconds to think about that.
Do you want us to write in the chat?
No, so this is just thinking, but thanks, Stephanie, for clarifying. I'm going to go to Midaxa. Midaxa, can you take yourself on mute? Tell us what might be the problem with that strategy?
I feel like you're only assessing one student as opposed to the entire class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. We're only assessing one student. That is one of the limitations. That's a limitation I'm not going to focus on right here, though, actually. We'll come back to that, but it's a limitation, certainly. I'm going to go to Jose. Jose, can you take yourself on mute? Tell us what might the other limitations be of that strategy? Jose, I'm not sure if you're there, but you're on mute at the moment, so we can't hear you. Okay, I'm gonna bounce off Jose.
Yes, me?
Oh yes, Jose, great, thank you. So,
thank you. I'm misunderstanding when you call me, but it's when students answer everything when everything else, like I don't know, maybe one is a correct answer, but like an example, an array start with a pony or something like that, something that didn't make sense. I think that is a red flag.
So the sample size of 1 it's a big limitation. Let's worry about this problem later of sample size of 1. Assuming that for some reason we're restricting ourselves to a sample size of 1, and I'm thinking about how am I gathering that sample size of 1? Like what's the process I'm using to collect that data, limited as it might be? Something which I think isn't like fantastic about the kind of common approach. I'm going to go to Stephanie. Can you take yourself on mute to tell us what you think?
Yeah, I think one of the things is, especially if you do it all the time, people are going to be more on their toes because they know they might be asked, so they're more likely to probably listen because they don't want to be uncomfortable if you ask them something. And the other thing is, well, most of the time, if you know, you're more likely to put your hands up. Then if you don't know, you might not say so. So you might have a bad vision of what the class really know or not.
So the idea of like some people putting their hands up, others not, which is coming a bit out of what Stephanie's saying, and it's something which well in the chat, which Mark and Dom are saying. So people who put their hands up basically not going to be representative of your class in a few different ways. So firstly, it's kind of like biasing extroverts, as Dom says, but in particular what Mark's saying, only smart Alex will put their hands up. So if you've got a class of 30, you ask a question, one person put their hands up, you call on them, they get it right, and you think, oh, fantastic, this class, like, they get this point, I can carry on. That's a self-selecting sample of people who are more likely to understand. And it doesn't, therefore, you'd be hasty to confidently from that think that, yes, this gives me a more accurate, sorry, this is a reliable source of data. So cold call is different. Cold call is something which I've just been doing a few examples of where you pick on people, and actually, like, people might still put their hand up, but you shouldn't just be picking people with their hands up. You're essentially trying to go for random sampling. So Ali, why would that be preferable in some ways to the kind of relying on hands up, do you think?
So you can push against the bias of sort of people who already know, and you can pick on people who you are more concerned about. And you could also potentially do sort of a keep track of in your head or written down somewhere, like who you have cold called during the lesson, and then sort of try and spread it around the rest of the class.
Yeah, that's great. I think all of those are excellent. So this idea of, like, firstly, if you're in a position where you know a bit about the class and like where they all are, you can be like more intentional with who you're choosing to answer rather than just limiting yourself to people who put their hands up. If you're keeping running track, you can spread it around, but also then it counteracts, importantly, that kind of bias of like the self-selection of hands up. So this is the main benefit, I think, a really big benefit of cold call, which is that strategy, just pick on people. There's one other benefit as well, which I would say is about learning culture. And Stephanie said something, I think, which relates a bit to this. But this is actually now slightly different to like gathering the data, but it's kind of a culture you're creating in the classroom if you use something like cold call. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about what that might be. You don't need to put it in the Zoom chat or anything. This is just thinking. So it's sort of like, well, what does the classroom look like if you're using cold call versus if you are just picking on people who have their hands up? What difference might that make to the kind of learning culture that's created? That's another 10 seconds. Gregory, can you take yourself off mute, please? Tell us like any thoughts on what difference it might make to learning culture.
I had pretty much the same thing as what Stephanie said, that people are just going to be more engaged because you could call at them at any time, and so they can't relax and lean back on, oh, well, I don't raise my hand, so I don't actually have to even try to figure out the answer to this one.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much, Gregory and Stephanie, for kind of teeing that up. So I think this is like separate from sampling. Cold call is really, really important because it sends a signal to the class that you have to be alert, because at any time I can pick on you. And if you do this enough, you make it low stakes as well. So that's important. It's not just I pick on you and then I humiliate you. Like, it doesn't work. This is not meant to be for like a culture of fear. where it's like, I pick you at random, you get it wrong, and I'm like, oh, wow, you idiot, you really suck. Like, no, don't do it like that. It's got to go along with this sort of like, it's okay to make mistakes. And like the general thing you're conveying is like, what you're doing is like, you're trying to elicit information from them to learn about your teaching. That's the kind of what you're trying to communicate. So do it in a way which is sympathetic, which is important, it's empathetic, but in a way which also communicates to the learners that, you know, stay on his toes, because at any point you can be asked to contribute. So if you're just slacking, if you're just like opting out, that's not going to work. So that's, yeah, sorry, that's exactly what I've just done there. And then this here is related to something which Ali was saying. So there's another strategy which goes along with cold call, which is known as targeted questioning, which is, well, you can read what it's there, and it's got, what's important is kind of quick series, strategic sample, short time period. So I'm going to go to Dom. Dom, do you have any thoughts on like strategic sample? Like what might that mean, and what might you look to? What might a strategic sample look like? How might you create it?
Well, I suppose it would attempt to take a selection of a student from a bunch of different groups that you had predetermined, perhaps competency groups. So you would manage to get somebody who is slower than the average and someone that is faster than the average. So you can somehow surface some of that discrepancy in ability.
Yeah, I think that's really great, Don. Thank you. So, because we're trying to understand what are they all thinking. The problem is they're not a homogenous bunch. If you're only sampling from like a very, very similar students, that doesn't tell you anything about the kind of other extremes. So you strategic sample, one part is going to be like making sure you're covering range to get different bits of information. And another question I have about that is open-ended questions. So why might open-ended questions be useful for this? Daniel, do you have any thoughts? Take yourself from mute.
Sure. So I think one thing is that often when you have like a very closed question, like either you can guess what the answer is going to be, even if you don't really understand, or kind of if you get it a bit wrong, you don't really understand why. Whereas the open-endedness both like doesn't guide them towards the answer so much and allows them to kind of almost explain why they don't, like why they get it wrong.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. So I think that's really important what Daniel just said, where the closed question, especially if just yes or no, like could just be good luck. You don't learn so much from it. Open-ended gives you more information into kind of exactly what they're thinking. The kind of quality of that data is a bit higher. So those are the two kind of strategies, cold call and targeted questions, which you can see kind of go together. They're not like, and so when you cold call, it doesn't have to be along with a strategic sample, but probably maximum effect is kind of when you kind of sprinkle them like that. So here is an example of how you might do kind of some targeted questioning. So let's say that we are just trying to explain how we set properties of objects, and like I've given some kind of explanation for the left-hand side. So I've showed them it, I've given some explanation for it. And then I've got kind of 3 questions here to the right. I think there's an important characteristic to do with those 3 questions, which makes it a good thing to use for like a strategic sample. I wonder, like, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to like, what do you think are the most important characteristics about those questions which might make them good for strategic sampling? I'm going to give you another, 20 seconds to think about that. No, 10 seconds. Neil, could you take yourself off mute? Is there anything you noticed about those which might make them useful for that targeted questioning?
They're open-ended, obviously, and they're set in an English language, so you can't guess based on You know, they're not just a code sample that you can tweak around. You
Mhm.
actually have to parse the sentence, understand the task. So if the student doesn't understand the task or the concepts of setting or the concepts of these properties, they're probably not going to be able to start.
Okay, thank you so much, Neil. So like Neil said, so it's open-ended, which we learned is something which is helpful, gives you more insight into what they're thinking. And you're not kind of just straightforwardly kind of giving them the answer in a way that they can just guess from kind of what's going on. I think there's something else when I think about them as a set, which is interesting to me when I think about kind of targeted questioning. Jake, do you have any thoughts on, like, if we look at them like together as a set, if I think about kind of splitting them out for targeted questioning, why might that be useful?
So I don't quite understand the question. Can you repeat it?
Sure.
If you
Yes, of
sprinkle
course.
the question.
So we've got 3 questions. I'm interested in considering them as a set because we learned with targeted questioning, there's this idea you've got a strategic sample and you can kind of like, you pass out questions to your strategic sample to gather some information. And there's something about the way I've designed these questions, which I think might be useful for strategic sampling, or it kind of makes it a good candidate for strategic sampling. I wonder if you think about them set and you look at them together, what might that be?
They kind of have similar answers, in my opinion.
So
I guess if you ask the first student and then they explain, and then you ask another student, I feel like the other student could. I don't want to say copy or be inspired from the last student, but I don't know if that's a negative or a positive.
Yeah, thanks, Dick. So I think something interesting there with the idea of like, there's always trade-offs in kind of the way we design things. And Jake's definitely noticed something there, which is important, I think, to acknowledge, where if you ask one student one and they get it right, and another student can kind of learn from that, makes it easier for them to answer subsequent ones. That's definitely true. What Jake said was they're similar. I think this makes it a good candidate for the kind of quick fire strategic sampling. So what this would look like the ideal thing you're looking for is you've done the explanation and they all get it. And then this is rapid fire. It should hopefully be easy. You ask one student, X, how do I set the current module topic to the string HTML? And you're looking for a very quick answer, which tells you they get it. Great, move on to your next one. Y, how would I set the current module teacher to string Ali? Hopefully they get it, great. Z, how would I set the current module session to number 2? Hopefully they get it, great. And rapid fire is basically what we're looking for. So I think of it like peppering. So you're like peppering questions out. They are quite similar. They're all testing the same thing, but you're with your strategic sample, you're kind of testing as much as you can, like at all across your kind of class, how well understood is this? And yes, latter questions are a bit easier to answer because they can, in a sense, learn from the first ones, although I think this is mitigated a bit by it being rapid fire. So if they didn't understand it from your explanation, someone answer your first question very quickly, that's probably not itself gonna be what gets them over the line. But actually, you know what, if that does help them, if they learn from, oh, when that's a question, this is the answer, I would suggest actually that is a useful thing for them to learn, like, oh, this kind of question can be answered in that way. That I think is kind of some evidence that they are beginning to understand. So I don't think that's necessarily a kind of overwhelming negative. So that's the kind of thing you might think about with the kind of targeted questioning.
Richard?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's me. So yeah, just 2 questions. The first one, I'd like to just, could you unpack strategic sampling a bit more? Yeah, what does that look like? Yeah, so that's the one question. The other one, probably more of a comment. So I think with rapid fire, I'm just imagining students who need processing time. So just different thinkers. There are people who just, who just need to process the question. There are others who can sort of respond off the cuff, off the bat. So how does that work with that kind of person?
Yeah, thanks for the question.
A moment to think about it.
So firstly, strategic sampling, unpacking that a bit more. So in order to strategic sample, this assumes that you as instructor, which you might not, and if you don't, then you can't do it massively well, but it assumes you have some rough idea of different students, like you split into blocks of 3, say, those who are struggling, those who you think can get an average amount of time, those who are kind of really pushing on. strategic sampling would be kind of making sure you've got coverage across all three groups. Because, for example, you might sample, if you were only to sample from the kind of the top group, that wouldn't actually give you a good representation of how the whole class is doing. And so you're just trying to build as complete a picture as possible with limited data, essentially, with that. Then, if you don't have that, then essentially random is the next best thing, I guess, you can strive for. In terms of thinking time, so you would hope with the level of, when you design your explanation and following rapid fire questions, you should be designing them with the intention that the rapid fire questions should be ones that could be answered very quickly. If you think for the class that actually these are not questions which could be answered very quickly, reliably, then you should probably work on making them simpler. So, for example, a good candidate might be, let's say you're introducing strings, and you say strings are like, you must have kind of double quotation marks, and you show them different things. You're like, does this look like a string? That should hopefully be a very quick yes, no. Does this look like a string? What about this one? What about that one? These all kind of quite simple. So it would be kind of like judging based on your class whether or not this is a question of appropriate complexity. So like you correctly identify, this won't massively work well if it's kind of lots of thinking time. Instead, what you might do is kind of what I've done a couple of times, where it's kind of, I have asked a question and I said, I want you to think about it. And then I've chosen one person. So complex questions require thinking time are more suited to that. They don't suit so well the kind of rapid fire.
Yeah, because I mean, my thoughts are that I think closed questions that have sort of a yes/no response may be better suited for rapid, perhaps. And sort of, if I look at the questions you have here, how could I set the current? It's an application question, so may need a bit of thinking time. So I'm just wondering, you know, the open question is a contemplative moment. I'm a bit of a thinker, and so I'm just thinking, I'm just putting myself in the shoes of other processes and wondering how that experience may be for them.
So I think something's possibly misleading when I'm presenting this, where like the idea is you've got the instruction and then there's some questions. It's not kind of look at this and now immediately answer this. So the idea is there would be some level, so you're explaining the things on the left. This is getting explained, and like that might involve some questions as well. Where you, and then kind of at a point where you're like, you want to quickly gauge, okay, now we spent a bit of time talking about this. I just want to confirm my suspicion that I think the class as a whole can now set properties on objects, which is, this is not necessarily, because I just went straight into, so I said like, you know, there's some instruction, and then we're going straight to questions. That gives perhaps a false impression that you're going straight into these. That wouldn't necessarily be the case. So it might be that you talk about this and you do like several examples. I would contend that somebody who understands how to set properties on objects, I would contend at that point, these should be rapid fire questions for them, or relatively rapid fire at least.
Okay, no, that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome. So to kind of flick through some kind of things which we went through. So I've just got here a slide which I've just called CFU, which is just my prompt for kind of checking for understanding, which is something you should always be thinking about when you're kind of teaching things. We've learned two kind of very specifically named things in this session. The first is cold call. So I'm looking for just a definition. It doesn't have to be perfect, but like, what do you understand by the idea of cold call? Evelyn, could you take us off mute and tell us, please?
Yeah, so with cold call, you're essentially choosing who's going to answer the question, and you're calling upon them as you ask it to get their response.
Great, thank you very much, Evelyn. My next question is, I would say there's two main benefits of cold call. One is to do with learning culture. One is to do with kind of data collection. I'm going to go to Dom. Can you take us off mute and give us one of those, please?
give you one of the two. Sorry.
Yes. So one of the two kind of main types of benefit of cold call.
So data collection and to grab the sort of get a reading of the culture. So the data collection is to see which students understand it.
Yes, but then why might it be superior for data collection to kind of typical practice?
Because you get a more representative sample.
And that it is indeed a more representative sample. And just to remind us, like that typical process, why would that typical process, if you give us a brief reminder of what it would look like, why would that not give you necessarily a good sample?
Because it biases the sort of students that are inclined to put their hand up anyway, which implies that they've understood the material and they want to share their understanding.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dom. So cold call, exactly as Dom said, giving us better kind of sampling, because the standard practice of like ask a question, hands go up, you call people, hands question, that's a self-selecting sample, not going to be representative, more likely people who know what they're talking about. And so, Tanis, could you give us that other benefit of cold call?
You mentioned about asking open questions, open-ended questions.
So that's something to do with kind of like the types of questions we might ask. So the benefits of cold call, I'd say, is split into two. So one is about kind of like the data it yields to you. The other is about the learning culture that it's implicitly a part of. So what does the kind of classroom, like how might learners like behave differently or think differently about their engagement if we're using cold call?
Yeah, thanks. No, so you said that it prevents people from being passive and just relaxing, and sends a signal to the class that they might be picked on at any moment, and they better ask for clarification if they're not clear with something, because their turn might come. I think this particular thought that if you don't understand something, ask, because it might be your turn at the next question, is something really nice to instill as a coach.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Thomas. Exactly right. You know, it keeps people aware. Oh, hang on, I might be asked. Therefore, I better make sure I'm paying attention. Better make sure I'm trying to understand things. If I don't understand things, perhaps it's better to kind of preempt that by asking questions. Thanks, Thomas. Then, what types of questions might be good for cold call and why? I'm going to go to Caroline.
So kind of open-ended questions that really, they don't require a kind of straightforward yes or no answer, but rather give the students a reason to kind of think about what they're actually doing and why they're doing that.
Great, thank you, Caroline. And then something which we briefly alluded to at the start was kind of cold call, kind of a single question only gives you an answer of like from one person. There are other things we can use to get more people involved, which we'll have to do another time because we don't have time now, but we mentioned this idea of strategic sampling. So what kind of things should we be thinking about with strategic sampling? I'm going to go to Jose.
Sorry, I don't get it in that. I don't get it in that part.
So the cold call, you get data from one person. So maybe we're going to try and ask a few people, but we're going to try and take a strategic sample when we're doing that if we can. What might we be thinking about with that strategic sample?
Okay, maybe that before you create a question, you need to create more examples of that kind of question and split all the question between the students.
So we definitely need like more examples of questions in order to begin sampling because we can't ask the same question repeatedly to different students. So that's definitely part of it. Thanks, Jose. I'm going to go to Chandra. What other things might we be thinking about when constructing our strategic sample?
I think I'd think of the groups of people that you're going to be asking. So like perhaps is this a question that will show you whether the different levels of people understand what you are teaching. I know you said it should be like an open-ended question so that you can kind of hear, even if they get it wrong, you can hear why they are getting it wrong from the question that you've actually asked. But yeah, I think you would ask a question that will be able to be answered by the different levels and kind of, if they get it wrong, you could hear why they are getting it wrong from the answer that they're giving by the way this question is constructed.
Thank you so much, Chandra. So the different kind of groupings which you're thinking about, trying to get coverage across them, ask questions in a way which gives you useful information, so open-ended questions helps. So thank you very, very much, Chandra and Jose, for kind of bringing that last one together. So to kind of wrap up then, this here, we're thinking about what are they thinking? This is the idea about real-time assessment to check that you're going in the right direction. And a good way to do that is cold calling, which isn't perfect because, as we've noted, it's got sample size of 1. So there are other strategies which we'll do another time, but this is a good one because it's kind of preventing kind of bias and also kind of learning culture, which it's creating is important. You can also kind of target the question with strategic samples to kind of get to slightly mitigate the sort of only asking one person. So as a final thing, I would like you to take 1 minute to think and reflect on what we've done. And then when you're ready, if you have things which you're ready to share, please pop them in chat. So a minute just to kind of reflect, try and focus on these sorts of 3 questions here, which I've listed at the bottom.
Richard, can I ask a question as well?
Yeah, please do.
How long does it take for you to get to the level of thinking all of this, plus your subject matter, plus everything? I mean, even you, as you're doing this lesson, are you like doing the lesson and you're thinking, are we getting it? And, and comfortable with all of that at the same time?
I guess other people are noticing this as well, but one thing I've definitely seen from sort of participating and also watching Richard do this is that it's all like he's doing this as well. Like the lessons are sort of self-reinforcing and you can actually play along at home. You can guess what Richard's going to do based on the content of the lesson.
Thanks, John and Chandra. So there is a lot. So basically teaching, there's always a lot to think about. And in a particular session, I will be focusing on particular, as John's identified, the things which I'm trying to communicate. So there are other things which suffer. So in this thing, for example, I would say cold call should be part of your toolkit. It shouldn't be the only thing you use. What I basically, how long does it take? So I would say kind of, because I taught as a teacher in a school where you're teaching like several lessons a day. And you obviously get a lot of chance to practice and things can become embedded. These are things which, you know, you're not going to listen to once and then automatically they're going to be second nature, obviously. So don't put that pressure on yourself. What I would like you to come away feeling is that you have like tools to use. So you should kind of like, it's a success if when you're teaching, you kind of, you know, what should I be looking for? So for example, you know, I should be thinking, okay, what are they thinking? That's a question I need to be asking myself. Oh, and also, if I'm wondering this right now, I have a couple of tools I can use to try and answer that. So that's what I'm aiming for. It's not about being this kind of perfect teacher. Like no one's like, I still have things I need to improve on. And this is all kind of gradual, just assembling over time, a larger and larger toolkit and a better and better sense of like when tools are more or less appropriate.
I have a couple of very quick questions, if I may.
Yeah, please do.
One is more simple. What do you do if you have a student that is clearly uncomfortable speaking out loud? Is that your responsibility to sort of to manage that? And the second one is, do you select students that look like they're not focused? Do you prioritize asking people that seem distracted?
Really good questions, Dom. So firstly, students who feel uncomfortable, I think this is tricky, opinions might differ. My personal approach is like, so that's symptomatic of a culture where there is not this feeling of like it's okay to make mistakes. If that culture existed, I think people would probably be quite happy to contribute. So my approach is, okay, the root problem is that culture hasn't been created. What can I do to make sure that culture is created? So I'm trying to do other things as well to make sure I continue to reinforce that culture. I personally would not stop asking that student questions. It's making sure, like, you might have an individual chat with them, make sure you understand. Like, I've done this with some students before where they said to me, oh, I feel really uncomfortable when you ask me questions. And then I say to them something like, when I'm asking you questions, I'm not testing you. What I'm doing is I'm actually checking the way that I've taught something. And it's a way for me to test, did I explain this well? Oh, no, I didn't. I need to explain this again. So whenever I ask you a question, like, it's more a way for me to learn about what I need to do and do differently. And I find that helps a little bit. So you can try and explain it around it. But I wouldn't stop. You know, it's kind of is pushing them a bit out of their comfort zone. I think that can be good for them. Second question, which was prioritizing students, yes or no, in terms of like those who don't look like they're focusing. I wouldn't say I'm prioritizing. I think what you're not trying to do is kind of make, so you want it to, I think, to be relatively subtle, this idea of like, oh, it's good to pay attention. And the kind of like, sort of someone's like, to be in an extreme case, someone's got their head asleep on the desk. You ask them, like, clearly they're not going to know. All that's going to happen is they're going to wake up and they're going to be like, oh yeah, like, oh, like, okay, I've been caught out. Now I'm perhaps embarrassed or slightly resentful. A kind of common mechanism for like behavior reinforcement is try and catch people when they're doing the right thing and like reinforce that. So there's students who I noticed were consistently not paying attention. What I'd like to try and do is like look for the times where they are paying attention and catch them then. So that they learn, if I pay attention, like, oh, actually, like I get interaction, I get attention, and like good things happen. I think like the occasional, like maybe a student who's maybe you're not sure if they're focusing, I think it can be useful as like a gentle nudge, but I wouldn't prioritize it as such because that then like that would suggest it becomes monopolized by students who don't pay attention. Like it's perhaps a small percentage, no more than 10% of your questions directed towards people who were like, I'm not sure they're paying attention.
Excellent, thank you.
You're welcome. I am conscious of time. I'm over that. So if you have more questions about this, I'd be super happy to, you can either message me after or whatever. But for sake of time, I think we're probably better to wrap up here. Chris? I think you're back, Chris.